Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. So we're going to start now with the last of our plenary sessions in this fourth conference on feminism. So it's the end of the third day. We have Nancy Fraser and OCHY CURIEL with us. We also have Christine Delphi was going to be with us, but unfortunately, due to health reasons, she isn't able to be here with us today. Now, Professor CURIEL and Professor Fraser, I'm going to start, if you will allow me, by presenting both of you, introducing you to the very few people who exist out there who don't know who you are. So, Professor OCHY CURIEL. She is an author, activist, born in the Dominican Republic, one of the most important key figures in Colombia. She's been living in Colombia for many, many years now. She's one of the main figures in the YALA movement and has been involved in many different movements. She is one of the founders of the Latin American Group for Feminist Studies, Training and Action, which focuses on different feminist movements. Now, for OCHY CURIEL, lesbian, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist feminism is the focus of your work. And you believe that there has to be an emancipation process, moving away from past thought in which everything has been very linear, in which there was a very specific subject, enlightened subject, which often you say that the decolonial Black feminism is actually making sure that everything is interlocked. There are many concepts that have to do with this. And in fact, we've talked a lot about interlocking and different types of merging and clashes. But you say, Professor CURIEL, that all of this needs to be articulated and we shouldn't just be doing all this by ourselves. So your proposal is a proposal for social transformation, and the subject of the policies and politics should be multiple. Now, I think this is one of the issues that we'll be talking about today. When we get going with the debate, we're going to be thinking about what sort of idea of unity are we actually talking about when we're making a call for unity. And in fact, we don't just have OCHY CURIEL with us, we also have Professor Nancy Fraser. Now, you were born in Baltimore, I believe. You teach at the New School for Social Research in New York. You work on many different fields. You are one of the authors of the Manifesto of Feminism for the 99%. You've worked with one who was here with us yesterday. You also have written a series of different papers in the hidden forms of feminism. Sorry, she's reading this very, very quickly. You talk about the different, how all of this needs to be taken out of the commodification sphere, which is a sphere that has been created through expropriation and not always through salary-based exploitation, which is what happens with the proletariat. And only this exploitation is only possible, not only thanks to the semi-proletarianized work of colonialized and racialized women. Now, in response to this, with this neoliberalism, which expropriates life, You say that what we need is that the socialist feminist needs to actually break away from this this love story. I think we should talk more about poly love. This is what I say, it's not what you say. And that we need to actually explore these bodies which have been commodified. Socialist feminism should think about the conditions of this neoliberal, financial, digital capitalism, which gains it has found different ways of making a profit. Now, this is an issue that has been dealt with by many of the speakers who have participated in this conference so far. And in fact, you all agree that it's not just original or originary accumulation, it's a continuous accumulation. This is what everyone has said. It's not just, it's an ongoing process. Now, bearing all of this in mind, this new era that we're in, this new type of capitalism that we're facing now, and what we can do to understand this new era, this is going to be one of the issues that we're going to be dealing with in our conversation. And let's get down to business. Let me just first of all explain how we're going to be organizing this roundtable debate. There will be 3 rounds of questions. I hope there's time for them. And in the first round of questions, or first question, I'm going to ask you a question that has to do with epistemological issues and how can we conceptualize this new era. And then the second question is going to focus more on how to organize the fight for emancipation in this new era. So don't answer the second question in the first round of questions, please. I'm just, this is why I'm giving you a sneak preview of what's going to come next so that you can actually focus on the right question. The first question there will be, could you please explain to us what is the problem for you, or the 2 or 3 main problems, conceptual or epistemological questions, when we're actually thinking about patriarchal capitalism today. Now we're going to start with you, OCHY, and then in the next round of questions, we'll start with Nancy, just to keep things fair. Well, first of all, I would like to greet all of you who are connected up and who are here. It's wonderful to be here, to be discussing these hot topics, these topics that are so interesting, not just for us, but for the entire feminist movement. Thank you, Jules, for chairing this panel. I'm going to talk about some issues that supposedly we've already overcome, but I don't think we have. Now, one thing is that we actually consider the patriarchal system as an autonomous system with its own dynamics. Now, there's been a lot of debate about this in theoretical terms and political terms, but nevertheless, I believe that we still tend to think that this patriarchy has a specific subject, women. And this, I think, is clear in the theorization, but also, and mainly, it's noticeable in politics. Now given our experience in Abya Yala, in which we're not just talking about decolonial feminists, there's other people involved as well. If we look back at history, if what characterizes our relations with the patriarchy and the other racist systems and capitalism, it has to do with the colonial system. This is what characterizes our relationship. And I'm going to be focusing on this relationship because I think it's key if we're going to understand our struggles, not just in Abya Yala, but in general. Now, this relationship, or if we analyze all this from this perspective, one assumption is that patriarchy, or what we call patriarchy, and this is a modern concept, by the way, will have its own characteristics, a specific set of characteristics, which are different from the other systems of domination. And we've been saying for many years now that the colonial system establishes different racial and social hierarchies, which are based on the division of work. And this is where original or originary accumulation occurs. And this accumulation has to do with the relationships that has to do with race. So here it's impossible to actually think about patriarchal logic without taking race into account. And race being understood not as something that is given or imposed, but rather as an ideological construction in which Europe is sort of sees itself as being the center of the world and the most important thing in the world. And all of this gives rise to race. Now, this issue of race has to do with this racial division of work, as well as a sexual division of work and social division of work. So one serious problem for us are those feminisms that still think that the patriarchy is outside of all of this. And I think what explains this is the fact that the political struggles, the political fights are really just only taking into account the patriarchy and are just simply ignoring all the other systems. And they don't take into account all of this together and how this affects women. Then they just look at gender from a de-classed way, a de-racialized way. And I believe that this is something that we need to continue to explore, because it's not just an epistemological and conceptual issue, it's a political commitment and a political approach as well. And all of this has to do with the fact that in these hegemonic feminisms, and this is a link to what I just said before, their main fight is against the patriarchy. This patriarchy, which is thinking about women in general. And the idea is that we have overcome this. I think this is what some people say. We understand that there are lots of different women. This is what people say. But actually, if we look at most of the struggles that are actually being carried out in feminism, well, they're still focused on this subject, which seems to be a universal subject, but which isn't a universal subject. Now, I'd just like to talk about just a couple of key elements that I can identify when I look at this whole issue. I think that for no one here, what I might say might seem a little strange, but I think it's important. I think that we're looking at a system that is extractive, which is cultural, which is social, in which territories are merchandise, they're seen as goods. Culture is an industry. They're specific industries for the different groups. We're talking about a logic of specialization for capital. There's accumulation as a result of dispossession. And all of this has intensified over the last decade. And this creates new areas of sacrifice, where we have mineral and energy projects, biofuel even, in which Latin America, Yala, continues to be a main source of this material, this raw material, and taking it to the international market. But these raw materials come from these racialized territories inhabited by indigenous peoples. And this all has to do with the logic of multinational companies. Most multinational companies that get here to actually exploit our land come from Europe. Although, of course, there are a couple of Chinese ones as well. China, in fact, has become more recently. Well, we probably need to analyze the whole issue of China, maybe separately. So with all of this, in all of this, nature is seen as an external thing. It's something that can be objectified. It's something that can be exploited. It's just a resource. And now there's also a kind of sustainable development, supposedly sustainable development. So now there's a kind of governmentalized environment, which is supposedly being governed and organized as a result of expert knowledge, but of course it all comes basically from the multinational companies. And in all of this, there's an exacerbation of violence. If we actually see what actually happened, and it's not just violence against women, this is affecting whole communities, where there are men, women, heterosexuals, homosexuals, Black people, indigenous people. And this conception this separation between what is human and what isn't human is also something that stems out of the Eurocentrism, because it just seems that we can carry on exploiting nature and it's not a problem. We also need to think about the financial capital in this global capitalism, in which there's also an international cooperation system, which is shored up by the World Bank, by all these different organizations, which continues to exert its superiority and priority over other underdeveloped countries. So we have the dismantling of public goods through privatization. The health service will be one example. What happened during the pandemic? And what's happening with the vaccines and the control over the vaccines, and this relationship between the global north and the global south is actually a sign, I think it's a very clear sign, that we are living in a system of death, mainly. I think there's no other way of putting it. So there are many, many issues that we can touch upon. And then, of course, we also have the rise of the right and the far right, or the extreme right, which is becoming more and more legitimate. We have a private institutional militarism, where there's a greater degree of oppression and less freedom. And another element that I wanted to talk about is that never have we seen in this Aviala such a high degree of migration, internal migration from people from Venezuela, Central America, for example, this mass migration that's happening within the continent itself. And all of this has to do with the different systems of oppression. So the question would be, what's the commitment of these different feminisms with these problems, with these systems? What's our commitment? What's our duty? Well, I think with very, very few exceptions, hegemonically, feminisms still tend to be focused on gender, binary gender, gender which doesn't articulate the issue of racism, neoliberal policies, migration, etc., etc. And I believe that when faced with this, given this terrifying panorama, I think that we have to really think long and hard about where we're heading and where these feminisms are heading. Because for many feminists, the most important thing is that women can liberate, that they can liberate themselves, that they can break the glass ceiling. But for us, we have a decolonial project. We want to fight against coloniality, externalize it, but also understand all of these different relationships between present, past, and future. Because there's no linear story there, then that is the commitment that we have. And I think that people who actually really want to bring about a full-scale social transformation should also mark this as a priority. Oh, and just one last thing before I finish. I think that at this moment in time, I think there's a return to the sort of the biologicist thinking, if we can say that word. There's an incredible force here in Aviala as well. And I think that we really haven't thought about this as much as we should do. And I think that we need to call attention to that as well. So that's what I want to say for now.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Wow, thank you very much, OCHY. Thank you. That was very, very clear. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be able to go back to something you've mentioned a little bit later on, Nancy. I'm going to pass the floor to you, and you've got about 20 minutes to speak.
Well, thank you so much, JULE, Elena, the whole team. And it's a real pleasure to be here in conversation with OCHY. I think actually there's so much agreement between us that we really miss Christine Delphi. I think we would have had some fireworks if she had been here. But as it stands, what I'm going to say is, in a sense, very much to reflect on very similar ideas and themes as in OCHY. Of course, I regret very much not being able to be there in person, and we're all looking forward to the time when we can gather together. But I can see just from the big list of people that are signed in now to this, and I gather for the whole rest of the conference, that Marxist feminism is alive and well and very, very international. So that is quite heartening. So I'm going to start just with a very quick word about the question of the present conjuncture. I think I'm going to want to say more about this in the second round when we really talk about the politics. But I just want to tell you that I've developed a term for how I think it would be a useful way for feminists and others who are concerned about the dire situation we are in and who are committed to fighting for an emancipatory alternative. I think we should think of the current period as one of cannibal capitalism. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. Let me just say, first of all, that the word cannibalism has several different meanings. And the most familiar and the most concrete meaning, which I think is probably the one that occurs to everybody, first of all, is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. Now, that meaning of cannibalism is burdened by a very long racist and colonial history because it was applied by a kind of inverted logic to Black Africans who were on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. If anyone was cannibalizing anybody, it was the other way around. So for me, there's a certain satisfaction in turning the tables and invoking the idea of cannibalism here to describe the capitalist class, the global ruling class, which I believe is a group that is currently and has always been feeding off of all the rest of us. Anyway, the term cannibalism also has a more abstract meaning, which captures what I think is a deeper truth about our society. The verb to cannibalize means to deprive one facility or enterprise. I'm reading a dictionary definition. One facility or enterprise is deprived of some essential element of its own functioning in order to create or sustain something else. That, in my view, is a good description of the relation of capitalism's economy, its official economy, to the non-economic precincts that support that economy, to the families and communities, to the habitats and ecosystems, to the state capacities and public powers, all those things which the economy, with its relentless pursuit of profit or abstract value, all those things that the economy consumes in order to fatten itself. So that's another sense in which the term cannibalism seems to me to work. Furthermore, there's a specialized astronomical meaning of this term. A celestial object is said to cannibalize another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. Now, can we ask for a better characterization of the way in which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system? And finally, there is the mythical image of the Ouroboros, which is a serpent that eats its own tail. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of this. I think that's a perfect image for a system that is wired to devour the social, political, and natural bases of its own existence, which unfortunately are also the bases of our own existence. In general, what I'm saying is that the metaphor of cannibalism offers a number of very promising avenues for analyzing capitalist society, especially the form of capitalism we are living through now, in which these cannibalizing tendencies have been liberated from whatever small and relatively ineffective restraints that curtailed them before. This metaphor invites us to see our society as an institutionalizing feeding frenzy in which the main course is us. Okay, now I want to say, having said that, that I think that feminists and for that matter, anti-racists, anti-imperialists, radical ecologists, all of the actors who are committed to emancipation, all of us should treat capitalism as the master category for our attempts to theorize the system we live in and the specific conjuncture in which we operate. And I want to underline capitalism as opposed to patriarchy. I'll say a little more at the end about why I don't like the concept of patriarchy. But in any case, we should treat capitalism as the master category for our analyses. However, we have to revise our understanding of what capitalism is. We cannot take on board the received understandings. They focus much too single-mindedly on the system's official economy. They identify the core injustice of a capitalist society with the exploitation of free-wage workers at the point of commodity production, and they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. These identifications are not so much wrong as incomplete. It's true that capitalist societies generate class exploitation at the point of production, and it's true that they generate economic crises non-accidentally, but as a function of their structural dynamics. However, they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationalities, which are equally structural and serious, but which fail to appear on the radar screen of our received understandings of capitalism. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are deeply implicated in the present crisis of cannibal capitalism. And if we hope to interpret this crisis adequately and to figure out how we can overcome it, we need to develop a new expanded conception of capitalism that foregrounds not just the system's economy, but, and here's the phrase I want to underline, the relation of its economy to the latter's quote unquote non-economic conditions of possibility. In my work, I have identified 4 such non-economic conditions of possibility for a capitalist economy. I'm going to outline them very, very quickly because I'm mindful of my time, and JULE, signal me when I'm going over. The first is social reproduction, and I don't need to belabor this at a conference like this one. You all know what I'm going to say, that we're talking here about the activities that create, socialize, nurture, sustain, and replenish the human beings who occupy positions in the official economy or are excluded from the official economy. You can't have a capitalist economy without workers, so-called, who produce commodities under the aegis of for-profit enterprise, but you can't have them without caregivers who reproduce human beings in settings external to the official economy. I want to skip all my sentences about what caregiving is. I don't want to bring coals to Newcastle, so to speak. But I do want to insist that wherever it's done, and it's done in a lot of different sites, and whether it's paid or unpaid, and how, and so on, social reproduction, as you know, is an indispensable precondition for producing commodities, for making profit, for accumulating capital. And yet, here's the point. Capital goes to very great lengths to avoid paying for care work, or failing that, to pay as little as possible for it. And that is a setup for trouble, because capitalist societies incentivize business to free ride on care work with no obligation to replenish it. They necessarily entrench a deep-seated tendency to social reproductive crisis, as well as a gender order that subordinates women. Capital cannibalizes care work. And if we find ourselves in a social reproductive crisis today, it's not an accident. And if we find ourselves living in a gender order that subordinates women, that too is not an accident, but an eminently structural consequence of the design of this system. Okay, a second precondition for a capitalist economy is ecological. And here I want to pick up on OCHY's very thoughtful remarks about nature. I want to elaborate those. Just as a capitalist economy depends on care work, so too it presupposes the availability of energy to power production, of material substrates, including the things we call raw materials, for labor to transform. It presupposes the existence of sinks for absorbing waste. Capital, in short, relies on nature in the sense, first, of specific substances inputted directly into production, and second, of general environmental conditions, such as breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, a habitable climate. All of those things we know are in big question today. And that's the rub. By its very design, capitalist society incentivizes the owners to treat nature as a bottomless trove of non-economic treasure, which is there for the taking and infinitely self-regenerating, hence not needing replenishment or repair. This too, we have finally realized, is a recipe for disaster. Capitalist societies institutionalize non-accidentally a structural tendency to ecological crisis, as well as profound disparities in vulnerability to the ensuing fallout. Now, those disparities point to my third condition for the possibility of capital accumulation, which OCHY has already mentioned, namely wealth commandeered from subject populations. Almost always racialized, such populations are designated in the system for expropriation as opposed to exploitation. They've been deprived of state protection and actionable rights through conquest and a variety of other mechanisms of subjugation. And so their land and labor can be and have been taken without remuneration and funneled into the circuits of accumulation. As OCHY mentioned, expropriation has often been seen as an early superseded feature of a system that supposedly piles up wealth only by exploiting free workers in factories, but that is a mistake. Capitalist production would not be profitable without an ongoing stream of cheap inputs, including natural resources, so-called, and including unfree or dependent labor that has been and is being confiscated from populations who've been subjected through conquest, enslavement, unequal exchange, incarceration, or predatory debt, and who are therefore unable or have great difficulty in fighting back. It has been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi, meaning that slave labor supplied the cheap raw cotton that fed the iconic textile mills in Northern England at the dawn of industrialization. But the same is true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa, Cupertino, you know, is the headquarters of Apple. Kinshasa is the site of coltan mining for iPhones, which is mined on the cheap there at times by enslaved Congolese children. In truth, then, capitalist society is non-accidentally but necessarily imperialist, continuously creating defenseless populations for expropriation. Its economy does not work if everyone is paid wages that cover their true reproduction cost. It doesn't work, in other words, without a global color line. That color line divides populations that are merely exploitable from those that are downright expropriable. By institutionalizing that division, capitalism also entrenches imperialism and racial oppression. And those two are defining constitutive features of the rapacious form of cannibal capitalism we are living through now. Finally, there's a fourth background condition for a capitalist economy, and that is public power. We usually equate public power with state power, and that's not wrong, but incomplete. There are other forms of public power. In any case, accumulation cannot proceed without legal systems that guarantee private property and contractual exchange, nor without repressive forces that manage dissent, put down rebellions, and enforce the status hierarchies that enable corporations to expropriate racialized populations at home and abroad. Neither can the system function without public regulations and public goods, including infrastructures of various kinds, a stable money supply. These things are indispensable for accumulation, but cannot be provided through the market. They only emerge via the exercise of public power. So capital needs such power, and yet it's also primed to undermine it, to weaken it by evading taxes, weakening regulations, offshoring its operations, capturing the agencies that are supposed to be regulating it. And so we have a built-in set of tensions in any capitalist society between the economic and the political. And that means a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. That means, on the one hand, crises of governance, in which the system destroys its own capacity to manage the problems it generates. Arguably, that's the case today with respect to climate incineration, with respect to global pandemics and many other issues, but also the system non-accidentally generates, at least in moments of crisis, crises of hegemony, in which masses of people defect from politics as usual. And here is where I would situate that question that OCHY raised, that burning question about the rise of the right. But let's hope there's also an opening here for the rise of a more coordinated, focused, and powerful left. That we'll talk about in the next round. To summarize, what I've been saying here is that capitalist societies institute contradictory relations between their economies and the latter's non-economic conditions of possibility. These relations become visible when we understand capitalism broadly, not as a mere economic system, but as an institutionalized social order that also includes social reproduction, nature, wealth expropriated from racialized populations, and public power, all essential to accumulation, all depleted and destabilized or cannibalized by it. Viewed this way, capitalism harbors multiple crisis tendencies and structural injustices. Above and beyond its propensity to economic crisis, the system is primed to precipitate social, political, and ecological crises. Above and beyond economic exploitation, it entrenches gender and sexual subordination, racial imperial domination, environmental injustice, and denial of everyone's political freedom. It's the ability to get all of that onto the radar screen as we analyze the present and the politics that we need to adopt to deal with this present, it's that ability to make all of that visible and to house it within a single conceptual framework instead of multiplying different systems, patriarchal systems, capitalist systems, racial systems. It's the ability to put it all together in one frame, I think, that speaks to the view of capitalism that I've been arguing here. And I think, as I'll say in the second round, this kind of view of capitalism allows us to situate feminism and feminist politics in a broader frame. It allows us to deepen the idea of intersectionality, which in my view is not just a question of overlaps among multiple axes of oppression and subordination. The deeper question is the social system that underlies those axes and of domination that generates them and that generates their overlap. And as we'll see, that idea, I think, is pregnant with a lot of great emancipatory political potential. If I have another minute, do I? Yes. Because I want to sort of use what I just said to make some very quick remarks that are responding to some questions that JULE sent to us, to OCHY and to me, and I'm not sure if they've been circulated more widely, but you asked whether or not capitalism is you stated, I think, not as that capitalism is a consequence and not a cause of sexualization and racialization. I want to make a comment or two about that claim. First of all, the claim poses an historical question. What is the cause of what? And what is the consequence of us? So it's posed in an historical register. I want to say that what I've just said here was not at all in an historical register. It was a structural argument. So I've talked not about what is the cause of what, but what conditions are necessary in order for something else to be possible. I'm not a historian, and I think that you would need a different kind of inquiry to talk about causes and consequences, one that I'm not in a position to provide. But I would say this: I don't believe that racialization precedes capitalism. I belong to the school that appreciates that there have been many kinds of prejudice before capitalism, many kinds of forms of empire before capitalism, but I don't believe they were systematically organized on the basis of a global color line. And I do think that race, but again, you'd need a historian to argue this case, and I can't do it. I do think that race is actually a product of imperialism. I would refer to the great book, unfortunately not as widely known as it deserves to be, by Oliver Cromwell Cox, Caste, Class, and Race, which makes this argument in a very powerful way. I don't like, as I said before, I wouldn't pose the question, does patriarchy, is it a cause, is it a consequence? I don't like the term patriarchy. I think it has a very precise and useful use in social theory for a pastoral form of social organization in which male elders dominate women, children, and younger men. I don't think it has the kind of male versus female binarism, which OCHY also, I think, rightly noted was problematic. I do think that there have been many forms of male domination in all sorts of societies that have preceded capitalism, and in societies that have claimed to be post-capitalist, although whether they really are is another question. But to me, the idea of looking for a master category is like, in my case, capitalism, or if you were writing about another era, feudalism for that matter. I think that the forms of male domination would look so different because of the larger context in which they're situated and elaborated, that I would be wary of hypostasizing male domination as a thing with a stable meaning. I think it's much more useful to periodize the larger forms of socialization in which male domination appears and from which it gets its character. There was one last question you posed, JULE, about whether the theory of value, and for Marxist feminists, this is an important question because, you know, we inherit from Marx what I would call a critical theory of capitalist value. And then we have the whole question of whether that critical theory is androcentric and usable by us or not. So let me say two quick things about that. First of all, I was very careful, at least I hope, in what I said before, to reserve the term value for talking about the official economy in which capitalism designates and treats certain kinds of activity and operations as value productive. I often use the term wealth as opposed to value to talk about forms of abundance and need satisfaction, things that satisfy needs that have not been monetized and treated as value within a capitalist world, but are essential to the production of value in the capitalist sense. I want to say, therefore, that the theory of value is valuable or worthy, that we need it, because it names a real abstraction. The theory of value is institutionalized in capitalist society. It's not just a bad idea in the heads of sexist men. It's institutionalized, it has real effects, it structures, it kills some of us and allows some of us to live more or less comfortably. We need this theory. We can't just dismiss it. But what we have to do is situate it within a broader world of wealth in which the operations of value production and value extraction cannibalize wealth and transmute it into value while leaving those who lived from it in a cannibalized, dire situation in order, as I said at the outset, to feed the wealth holders, the power holders, the capitalist class. So I think I can stop there, but I found your questions, JULE, very provocative. And I'm, like I say, I think I may be overestimating how much OCHY and I agree. There might be disagreements. I'm eager to hear. But one thing I could tell you that is if Christine had been here, we would have had some
No, that's a pity. That's a pity. Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, Fraser, Nancy, por esta.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy Fraser, for this wonderful presentation. Well, before we move on to the second round, you've been talking about so many things. It's true that you've got many points that you consider that need to be reconceptualized and also reorganized, probably. We'll talk about that later. You mentioned, for instance, accumulation, continuous accumulation by dispossession. You mentioned expropriation and how it advances on the basis of exploitation. You mentioned conservative reactions. You mentioned all these topics we'll be talking about in the third round. You both, in different ways, talked about privatizing public powers, whether in a state format or in other formats, whether they are common or not. and that transformation of liberal architecture into other architectures. You also mentioned, well, OCHY made a criticism of patriarchy and a specific conception of it. You also made a different criticism of that conceptualization. And now I don't know, you will have the floor now, but I don't know to what extent you agree on the fact that we need a single system, a single conceptual framework. So how do you understand this single framework? I mean, part of the decolonial feminist criticism was against this single framework. So my question is it really possible to unify a single framework? Is it really necessary to unify our fight to have a single framework? And here I would like to introduce something that was mentioned by MOVE and by Post structuralist, versus Habermas and other currents. They say that agreement always leads to exclusion. And this is in this book about redistribution and recognition. So this issue, how do we understand this? Because we've got a problem with universality. We know that we need to rethink about it, re-articulate it. And like yesterday, someone said, we need to talk about multiverse, right? Instead of talking about universality, right? And multiversality. That's what we should be talking about. I know I'm covering many things here, but now in the second round, I want you to tell us how we can articulate all these axes: migrations, expropriations, climate changes, state privatization, digitization. How can we articulate all this in fights so that the emancipation belongs to all of us in this new neoliberal era where most people don't have stable job or don't have paid jobs, where capitalism is decentralized at the bottom and monopolized at the top, where there are many divisions that are emancipatory and some other times are not, because to what extent division in the class is interesting? What class are we talking about? Internal versus other classes? Because in the afternoon panel, some people were talking about 99%. And what the proposals are for the organization of this emancipatory fight to fight the digital capitalism. And I insist on the digital side of things, this technology side of things that we don't understand very well now. And I'm going to introduce the term patriarchy because we do talk about patriarchy as well. So this system of domination, how can we articulate it in our fight and in our reality? Nancy, would you like to start? And then I hand the floor over to OCHY, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Well, these are really great questions and pressing questions. So from what I said before, you can see that I believe it's useful in principle to have a sort of a map of the social system that we live in. And I don't know for sure whether, one can find a place there for everything. I don't know for sure whether I've found a place for the things I want to be in there that's adequate, but it's an attempt, it's an offer to say that we all live in one world. I mean, the climate crisis makes this so clear. The pandemic makes this so clear. We all live in one world. We are very differently situated within that world. And therefore, what we experience as the most pressing issue, the most urgent existential problem for us, let's say for me, is not the same as, say, for OCHY or for for other groups of people. We are differently situated. Our lived experience of crisis, of injustice, right, of all the bads, of what is existentially threatening is not the same. But my hypothesis is there is something that underlies all of that difference, all of that multiplicity, and we can name it. We can analyze it, we can say what it is, we can give it a name. I mean, you know, just autobiographically, I remember very well the very first big anti-Vietnam War demonstration I ever attended. It must have been in around 63, 64, I'm not sure. And a speaker who was then president of SDS got up and said, we have to name the system. And then he said, the system is imperialism. Okay, I haven't said it's imperialism, but the system I've described is imperialist. But I think this idea of naming the system is so empowering. And it points to what are at least some of the deep things that have to be changed. The law of value, its ability to determine who lives and who dies, right? What's dumped into the atmosphere, who gets a vaccine and who doesn't. This is all of these things. There are many things that are obstacles, but if you don't change at least the way this whole economy, non-economy, cannibalization things works, you won't get anywhere. So it identifies some baseline necessary changes. Let's say necessary but not sufficient, and it identifies something that ought to be or could become at least that much a widely shared view, which does not in any way mean that everything has to be shared, right? So on your question about universality and how to articulate everything, let me just cut to the chase. I can think of, and I think this was implicit, JULE, in what you just said. I can think of 3 answers to the question, how do you build a counter-hegemonic bloc that is sufficiently powerful and broad and inclusive and has vision and has heft? I'm not trying to build a Leninist party. I'm not trying to build some sort of loose alliance. I think we've got a hegemony that is killing us. We need a counter-hegemonic bloc. Gramsci is my go-to guy here, okay? How do we do it? You mentioned 3 possibilities, and I've played around with all 3 of them, and I'm not even sure which I go for. So you mentioned the 99% idea. Now that's populist language, right? The 1% versus the 99%. I am not a populist, right? I'm a democratic socialist, of whatever that means. But this is very powerful language. And so in the manifesto, we used it. We took a lesson from Occupy Wall Street, from Bernie Sanders, from left-wing populism. I don't think left-wing populism is the answer, but maybe it's a transitional stage on the way to a more, let's say, programmatically precise, right, political vision. That's that. The next one is the sort of multiple subject positions. This may be, I don't want to put words in her mouth. This may be the kind of thing that OCHY is talking about. I want to hear what she says. And that has a big advantage it welcomes everybody in and doesn't require them to put aside their identity, to change how they think about themselves. It says, all you have to do is sign on to this cognitive picture about how the capitalist system works. Keep your identity, it's fine. Keep your, right. And let's somehow try to put all this together. The question is whether that approach has enough affective glue to hold it all together, because it's a cognitive thing that's shared, right? And the third idea, you mentioned the working class. So another possibility is to try, just as I gave a view of an expanded view of capitalism, what if we tried to develop an expanded view of the working class? It's not just people who work in mines, factories, on construction sites for wages. It's everyone who does socially necessary care work, whether it's paid or unpaid. It's everyone who sustains a habitat, a natural ecosystem in which their community lives. It's everyone whose activity satisfies social needs, whether they are producing commodities or uncommodified need satisfactions. In that sense, we are all doing the work and they are all eating us alive. So that's also, I think that for me, the question is, can we develop that kind of view of the working class that also allows those multiple subject positions? In that case, you'd have sort of three things. You'd say, yes, we're all different. We are adopting an indigenous identity for as a, as the way in which we mobilize around what are the most pressing issues for us, or we are adopting a Black Lives Matter anti-racist identity as a way of mobilizing for, but we are also all part of this global working class. We're all being eaten alive by capital. And maybe we could also all share that cognitive frame that gives us a little bit. This is very ambitious. I'm thinking big because we are in such an urgent situation, and the other side is thinking big. Whether we're getting proto-fascist forms of authoritarian right-wing populism. If one thing I can tell you, the worst thing we can do politically right now is run for protection to the liberals. That's the worst thing we can do. We have to actually offer a real alternative to the fascists and the right-wing populists. We cannot talk about bipartisanship. I mean, the stuff that goes on in the United States, the moderates, blah, blah, blah. No. So I'm thinking, I think that what we need to be thinking about is how to build a counter-hegemonic bloc, a historic bloc in Gramsci's sense. And, socialists have always understood at the very least that they had to unite workers and peasants in the North and the South. We ought to be thinking in these terms. Who are the blocs who are the forces, the constituents that we want to see come together somehow around a shared emancipatory project in a way that leaves everyone plenty of space to articulate and fight for their own priorities. Let me stop there.
Muy bien, pensar a lo grande.
Fantastic. Thinking big. Brilliant. OCHY, the floor is yours. Off you go. What have you got to say? Right, well, I think that the first thing that we need to think about is what do we mean by a single conceptual framework? Is it, because I think this is the conceptual framework which is going to determine the different policies. The concept is going to determine the application because it will determine from where we're working. So I think it's quite problematic to say that we need to have a single conceptual framework. There are many different conceptual frameworks which could help us to think in about a political project, because I agree with what Nancy has said. We seem to have lost the sound. We need to apologize. So you asked, what sort of organizations do we need in this new era to make sure that everybody can be emancipated? I would say everyone, of any gender, not even just of any gender. And I think that I'm going to talk about liberation projects, because I understand liberation to be a project which doesn't just emancipate us, but it actually creates something else. It's not just a case of resisting. Resistance is a more dynamic concept in this sense. So there are a couple of things. I don't think that capitalism is the conceptual framework which explains everything. I think that Black feminists and decolonial feminists have been saying for a while now that from our specific position and our specific stance, capitalism wouldn't have been worldwide without the exploitation of racialized labor from indigenous peoples and communities, and the African peoples as well, and slavery. So this is a historical fact. It is a historical phenomenon. This is something that has been shown by many critical historians, both men and women. So I think that when we talk about interlocking, and I don't really like to talk about intersectionality, and I've said this loud and clear in many different forums, because when we're talking about interlocking, then we're looking at the articulations which have occurred in the capitalism of yesterday and the capitalism of today. And I think they follow the same logic, even though their social manifestations are slightly different. What's that same logic? Appropriation. The appropriation of many different things, and we all know what we're talking about this. It's a really important concept, appropriation. And Christine, I would just like to take a moment here to send you a warm embrace and my best hopes for your swift recovery. But this accumulation, this capitalist logic can't be understood without racialization. It cannot be understood without sexualization, heterosexualization. This is what we've done. This is these systems which have been articulated historically, and of course, the way in which they express themselves change, but this is the actual underlying truth to all of them. So what type of organization do I think we need? Well, I think that more than organization, I think we should talk about political project, and a political project of liberation. And I think that this needs to be designed by all the condemned people, men and women in the world. All the people who are there at the interlocking site and who are affected by all these different systems of oppression. This doesn't mean that a white person can't be anti-racist or anti-fascist. No, and I'm going to talk now about the other element that I wanted to talk about, which is the issue of identity policies and identity politics. This is, again, something that I talk about very often. I think the majority of social movements have focused on identity issues. Feminism for women. Black people have to be anti-racist. Indigenous peoples have to be this. Lesbians and trans have to fight against heterosexuality. And of course, because this is true, because this is a sort of oppression that affects us more directly. But if we understand that these systems of dominance or power, whatever you want to call it, go beyond just the people that they're affecting directly and have a broader effect. And if we see them as part of this sort of same system, interlocking system, then in fact, all fights need to be a fight against all systems of domination. And what I said before about how feminism continues to be based on gender is an example of what I'm saying now. However, it doesn't matter how much I insist. Okay, we've got intersectional feminism because I'm a Black person. I think about Indigenous people and I think about immigrants. No. How are you formulating your social project? How are you doing it? It's based on identity politics. Now, Spivak said this a long time ago. Identity is something strategic. It can't be the end. Now, I'm going to position myself as a lesbian, as a Black woman. I have a story, of course I do, which enables me to perhaps weave a coalition based on similar horror stories, but it has to be around a political project. And identity makes us think that the feminism is still feminism. And sometimes, I don't know, we think about maybe we should invent a different kind of category, really. I'm a decolonial feminist. I'm a feminist, but I'm a decolonial. But I think this whole idea of identity and categorical identity needs to be rethought. Why do we have to give feminism a surname or a prefix? Black feminism, decolonial feminism. Why? Well, because we're making a reality more and more complex. And because we're actually realizing that feminism without a prefix, it doesn't necessarily cover everything. So the question, which is there, and it's always the same question, is that what should we do? What should we do? In this project, what should we do with these specific demands that we have to respond to? Okay, well, tell me, what are the specific demands of women? What are they? Because I have colleagues who are women, but in fact, they're being most affected by structural racism more than by sexism, or because people are stealing, they're grabbing their lands. And of course, they are also suffering sexual violence and gender-based violence. Okay, but in this context at the moment, gender is always racialized, and race is generalized, class is racialized and genderized. And this is what we've seen for so many years now. And the consequence of this, the consequence of thinking of these interlocking systems is it has a major effect on what you want to do politically. So this means also, and this is the other element that I wanted to mention, this means that if we understand that all of these systems of domination are not just limited to identity, but in fact also touch upon other things. For example, we have state centrism, this over focusing on state. This is an important issue, for example, especially in decolonial feminism. Coloniality is affected by capitalism, heterosexualism, etc. So when we're talking basically about how this coloniality generates a type of society which is overly focused on the state, and we all understand what this means, this neoliberal racist apparatus does. When we're seeing this, that this is the case, perhaps we should start thinking about the state. I mean, I'm not saying that we should be anarchists, but perhaps we need to think about what state means. And when we're talking about the redistribution of the wealth in the world, which is extractivist, etc. And in this sense, I would say that beyond any analysis that we can carry out of the state or any disputes that we have with the state, for example, to try to make sure that vaccines actually reach everybody, even people in the global south. Over and above that, and I think this is what I have tried to do, what we need to try to do is to achieve autonomy. But with regard to the specific demands of women, who say, no, the left-wing parties, I have a lot of sexist people in them, men. Well, that's true. But in fact, most feminists are racist. So how can I resolve this? How can I come out of this impasse? Well, for example, most of Afro, indigenous, feminist, etc. movements are also heterosexist. So this, we need to understand this when we're thinking about the logics of power. The logics of power which are repeated and reproduced within this logic of intersection and interlocking as well. Now, I know that many people won't want to hear this because they want to continue with this logic of separatism, because we're liberated from a certain point of view, but from a different point of view has actually fragmented us, especially from a community point of view. And Afro and indigenous communities think that it is absolutely vital to return to the community fabric. And it doesn't have to be in a rural environment, which is what people tend to think. as Maria Lubones would say, we have these different fractured bonds. We need to find these fractured bonds and we need to glue them back together. And everything that I have experienced has helped all of us to do that. So it's a project of liberation. Is necessary. It's necessary more than ever today, because we're faced with this death system, and this project of liberation needs to fight against all different systems of oppression. How? Well, I don't think we have time in this plenary session to talk about how. I mean, I think we'd need a lot more time to talk about it, but I think that thinking that women need to fight by themselves because all men are sexist. Well, feminists are racist as well. That's what I want to say. And they're classist as well, a lot of them. So that's what I wanted to say. You've got time if you want to carry on. Well, I'm just trying to sort of gather all of these ideas. You're true. We'd need actually another conference to talk about the how, but just trying to go back and think about some of the things that you've talked about now. It's difficult. We know this, right? Without these conceptual frameworks that are shared, without, not the same, but shared conceptual frameworks, it's difficult to actually articulate a shared fight, a shared struggle. And you're right, OCHY, we fight against everybody. We're fighting men, we're fighting racists, we're fighting classes. I mean, we're just fighting each other. The problem is that the community is divided. And when I'm talking about community, you understand what I'm saying. The communities are divided, we're fragmented. How can we build something in common? How can we structure the public power? How can we think about it in a different way? Because the state precedes liberalism. They were there in China all over. So one of the questions I think that you have alluded to is how can we construct the public power? Because people need vaccines, people need a cure for cancer. I mean, people need to survive. So there are certain issues that are urgent, and there are others that aren't quite so urgent. And then, of course, one of the problems is how can we combine these two paces, the urgent and the not so urgent, in these spaces, these new spaces that we need to create. And this is what Nancy talks about in her books, the public space, how to think and how to create other spaces. Now, you've also touched upon a couple of issues that perhaps I'd like to go back to in this next round of questions. So, two issues. OCHY, you talked about death systems, systems of death. Nancy talked about cannibal capitalism, but we're talking about necro politics, necro-liberalism, right? What can you talk about? What can you say about that? What do you think? Necro politics, necro capitalism? I don't know, I'm sure, OCHY, you'll be talking about the colonial system as well, and then coloniality maybe, but what could you both say about that? And then secondly, the spread of poverty always leads to a polarization, and therefore the rise of fascist systems and the far right. I think we can all agree with this. Neoliberal fascism, we can perhaps call it, or the far right, the extreme right. But you, OCHY, you said that there is a conservative reaction within the left, homophobia, transphobia, etc., etc. That happens as well, that occurs. Now, this problem, I think, is an added problem to the issue of the fact that things are very complex. When things are complex, it's so easy to just try to simplify them, which is what populism does. And I'm actually quite in favor of the strategy of the left-wing populism. But when things are so complicated, there is a tendency to simplify, and that gives rise to polarization, and it gives rise to conservative movements. And in fact, we see conservative movements in the left-wing politics as well. So I'd like you to talk about both these things: necro politics, necro capitalism, and then the rise of a conservatism with regard to, for example, prostitution or wherever you like. OCHY, it's your turn first. Right, gosh, I've only had time to actually write down some key words because you were talking so fast. Well, okay. Let's start about necro necro-capitalism. I mean, you can call it what you like. I think the main issue here is that what we're losing is life. But then we go back to the question of whose lives? And which lives matter more than others? So in other words, now the capitalist, racist, neoliberal system, etc. I'm not saying it doesn't affect most of the population of the world, but within this large-scale population that's being affected, only some people who are actually being affected very, very harshly. And this has to do with everything that we were saying before. This capitalist logic, which turns everything precarious, both paid and unpaid work, it makes it precarious, this system decides who is actually going to be more affected by this. Immigrants, Black people, peasants, those of us actually within this capitalist necropolitical system, we still have some privileges. And then of course, with the pandemic, all of this became very, very apparent. So I think that a necropolitics is directly aimed at those subjects, those beings, etc., that constitute part of this social common space that we're all trying to work towards creating. It's not a coincidence, and we can see it very clearly in Colombia with the armed conflict. I'm here in Bogota at the moment. There's massacres all over the place, but who are they aimed at? Not the middle class, not the higher class, the peasants, the Afros, the African people, the same people who are actually looking after the land so that you and me can live. So it's not necropolitics just because in this death system, actually looking after the place where we live is a political commitment. We need to look at who are the fundamental subjects and who's being affected by all of this, and they are one and the same people. I think that's very clear, so I'm not going to talk any more about this. Now, the issue of the right and the far right has to do with this liberal politics that we have all naturalized. Ask yourselves, why do most people, well, I know it's a bit of a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why are the people in the worst situations, why do they vote for the right-wing parties? Why do they do that? Because the left, in terms of government at least, well, the answer is because the left hasn't actually provided a solution. They've provided no way out of this death system. That's why they do that. If we look at what happened in Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, etc., the same projects that we have here, the socialists, are actually just doing exactly the same as what capitalism did. Why in Bolivia are they talking about the plundering of land? The socialists are doing exactly the same thing as the right-wing governments did in the past. Now, I know that there's a blockade on Cuba, and there has been a blockade on Cuba, which has actually prevented the left-wing government there from doing many things that it wanted to do. But the right-wing isn't just in government. We can see the right-wing ideology in schools, for example. The far right is occupying the public space. They're in the media as well. It's a logic that we can't just limit to governments. It's not just in governments. Right-wing ideology is all over the place. And I'm not just talking about the right, I'm talking about the far right, the extreme right. And I think that everything that we're seeing in the world today is a result of, well, many of the things that we're seeing is a result of this. And I think we're seeing it even in the feminist movement. And I think we need to, denounce it for the good of not just feminism, but for the good of the entire world. So I think, oh, hang on, just one more thing. You were talking about what's urgent and what's urgent, right? That's what you asked, JULE. Well, I was actually never been a member of a left-wing party, but I've worked in close collaboration with them. And the left wing, you know, they told us for years, first the revolution and then we'll worry about women. This is what they told us for many, many years. But of course, you know, I mean, we know this. We know that there's a major shortfalling of the left-wing parties. But what is urgent? What isn't urgent? Well, as decolonial feminists, as colleagues who are trying to build decolonialism, everything is urgent, everything. And of course, this, you know, overburdens us with a huge amount of work. And of course, we have to see what it is that we need to articulate, because we have to do it all at the same time. I can't just fight against capitalism and just focus on all of this, when in fact the people who are dying in this country are the Black people, the African people, because I'm looking at what's happening in my country. Pregnant women are being taken out of hospitals because they're from Haiti and they don't have the proper documents. They're being taken out of hospitals when they are pregnant. And it's not because they're women, it's because they're Black Haitian women and they're migrant women. This is the issue, and this is urgent. Lots of things, lots of ideas altogether. Yeah, you're right. There's so many things. Well, I hope that we'll always have so many things to think about and the conversation never ends. Nancy, your turn. Off you go. I'm not going to start talking because others will run out of time before I finish. So it's up to you now. Over to you.
Well, again, there are many, many issues on the table. It's hard to even know where to begin, but it's very rich, and I'm passionately interested in everything that's been said. On Necro Politics, I mean, that's a term famously that Achille Mbembe has developed, and I hadn't thought of it until you brought it up, JULE, but of course, there are lots of overlaps with the idea of cannibal capitalism. The difference, of course, is the identification of capitalism as the sort of, as I say, the master category. But it's really true that you feel that there's some kind of a death trip. I mean, just look. I don't know how much of this you have in Spain or in Colombia or wherever people are sitting now who are listening to this, but I mean, we're, you know, just overwhelmed in the US by this anti-vax, anti-mask stuff. I mean, these people are on a real death trip of some kind. And the level of, it's almost psychotic, really. It's very, very hard to understand how you could possibly translate their quote unquote grievances into some kind of rational program. So I think that we also need some kind of a psychoanalytic current here to, you know, we're dealing with questions that cannot all be answered within our rationalist frameworks, that's for sure. Then the second question, okay, so that gets me into this whole question of the rise of the right. Well, here, I think I very much agree with what OCHY was just saying, that this is part of what I refer to as the breakdown of hegemony. And neoliberalization was conceived and developed and consolidated by a range of different governments throughout the world. But we can say that the most causally consequential were, let's say, the US, the UK, Germany. And because, you know, that's where the whole financial architecture of the world changed, the rules of the road changed, that, right? And the irony, which I think most people may not realize, is that neoliberalization in those power centers was not brought to us by conservatives. It was brought to us by liberals. It wasn't really Reagan and Thatcher. It was Tony Blair's New Labour. It was Bill Clinton's New Democratic Party. These are the governments. It was Schroeder in Germany. These are the people that deregulated Wall Street, that's allowed trading on own account for investment banks, that you know, evacuated the whole distinction between commercial and investment banking, et cetera, et cetera. And they didn't do this alone. They did this in a hegemonic bloc, let me repeat that phrase, with liberal feminists, with green capitalist eco-political groups, with thus what Keeanga-Yamana Taylor calls the black faces in high places version of the post-civil rights era. So it's when things finally cracked up, and from where I sit, and it will be different in different places, but the key date is 2016, which is the Trump's defeat of Hillary Clinton and the Brexit vote. At least in those two power centers, we even have a date for when people finally said, basta, you've hollowed out our living standards. And, you know, they found these leaders, these causes that promised them protection. And they promised them to turn back the clock. Take back control was the Brexit slogan. Make America great again was the Trump slogan. So they are saying to people who are seeing their status and their economic position decline, we're going to give it back to you. We're going to protect you. They promised protection. Protection is the absolute key word for these, and all of the strong men everywhere, Bolsonaro and so on and so forth. Of course, the irony is that those who promise protection are really the predators, and they can't and won't protect anybody. They are in bed with the very forces that have, destroyed their living standards to begin with. So, this is why I think it's so important to have a counter answer to them. And this is why I strongly agree with OCHY's idea that resistance is completely insufficient and that we need a project. We are totally on the same page with that. And I like very much, OCHY, the way you contrast the sort of orientation toward identity versus that of a project, right? Identity is we are this, and that determines. So I would say, you know, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't distinguish different strands of feminism in terms of the identity groups that they claim to articulate, but we distinguished them in terms of ideological project. We talked about liberal feminism, we talked about socialist feminism, we talked about radical feminism. Each of these had a different image of what a post-patriarchal, if I can use that word, society would look like. And so I want to insist nowadays that I am a Marxist feminist. And that is not a question of identity. That's a question of my ideology and my project. And I would proudly use that label for myself, even though I'm very unorthodox, and I've just presented to you a way of taking some of Marx's insights and reframing them, resituating them in a much broader conceptual framework. So why do we have to, this is one kind of response to one thing OCHY said, why do we have to present ourselves now as feminists at all? I don't know that we have to, but I do, at least in some contexts. And the reason is because our political landscape features a movement that uses that language, and they use it in the service of upward mobility for professional managerial status women to crack the glass ceiling, et cetera, et cetera. And as long as that language of feminism is associated with that politics. And as long as there are masses of people who do think of themselves as feminists, then I need, and I hope others will agree, that we need to contest that liberal feminism and say, no, that is not feminism per se. Here's another feminism. And this feminism is not only intersectional, but it is very much oriented toward that kind of a counter-hegemonic bloc. It wants to be with those who mobilize as anti or decolonialists. It wants to be with those who mobilize as anti-racist or Black liberation fighters. It wants to be with them. You know, in each of those cases, the people in question mobilize as something. And the question is, who among all of them are the right allies or partners or co-block constituents, whatever language you want to use for us, for people who have the politics. This is a Marxist feminist conference, so I'm assuming that a lot of people might like that phrase, Marxist feminist. So we are saying this is the right kind of feminism if we want to create this kind of counter-hegemonic bloc. Defect, leave the Hillary Clintons, leave the Sheryl Sandbergs, join us instead, do something different. That's not going to help you. That's not getting anywhere. So, Jule, you asked how to construct public power, and this is very much part of that question of what is the project. I don't know how it should look in the end, but I know that we need it. And that in the short term, at least, the world needs more rather than less coordination to deal with large scale pressing problems. That the weakening of public power only means the strengthening of corporate power. And whether it'll eventually wither away in some misty future, who knows? But for now, it's a necessity. And so I think the question is transitional socialist program. What do we do now with respect to public power? And I have some modest proposals. Let's organize, and this will address some questions that have already been raised. Let's expropriate the pharmaceuticals who claim to have intellectual property rights in vaccines and life-saving medications. Let's reverse the privatization of all the vital healthcare infrastructure that has been devolved into private hands where it exists at all. Let's also expropriate the energy corporations. Let's build a campaign that energy is a public good, and we have to decide which kind of energy and how, and so on and so forth. It's got to be totally disconnected from the profit motive, both of these things. And let's do the same while we're at it with the arms manufacturers, with the whole so-called defense industry, military industrial complex. And finally, and this gets to the digital, let's do it for the IT mega corporations. Let's do it for Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, whatever, and the Chinese counterparts to all of those things. That's about, you raised the digital. So I just want to say how excited I am now to have just finished teaching what is by far the best book I have come across. This is a book recommendation, Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism. This is a brilliant book about the extractivism of data, which is what the real thing, they say they're helping us make connections, but they're actually mining us in order to sell predictive algorithms that better target us for advertising and so on. So let's expropriate them as well. let's say these things are public goods. This is part of infrastructure. And the second you get the profit motive involved in them, then everything gets cannibalized. This is what's eating us alive. Okay, that's a modest proposal for a project, transitional socialist project.
Very modest, I wouldn't say it. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. We've got some time for questions. Now there are many questions in the chat. I'm going to be picking one or two of them, if you allow me to. But there are two things I would like to comment on, and maybe there will be time to comment on them, for you to comment on them as well. One would be digital capitalism. What is going to be happening with behavioral surplus? We're talking about extracting the value of something that's not scarce. I mean, here many things change, right? There are many things we need to reformulate here. This is why I'm talking about the theory of value, because obviously it's necessary. The problem is what type of theory of value do we want, right? Even within the Marxist school, what type of theory of value are we going to be conceptualizing here for them to become a reality? Because value is an abstraction, but value goes beyond that abstraction and not just use value, right? That's something else. We need to reformulate that. We need to reconceptualize this. And the other element would be identities. I think I've read your work and I've been listening to you. I think that when we talk about identities, we've got a problem with identity because, well, identity exists, it has to exist, but we haven't socialized the fact that identities are materials. I mean, identity is a semiotic dimension, if you want to call it that way, of the different materialities. And that's why it's something mobile, and in many cases can change and vary depending on the position and the material conditions. We have other subjectivities of that, which is what we call identity. So I think that we are understanding identity wrong, and we're going towards conservatism, because the same thing applies to motherhood, for instance. So there's that trend in terms of identity that brings me to thinking, how are we going to be thinking about materiality in the 21st century? And we could include here the post-human element, the relationship between individuals and nature. The individuals are as common materiality and the relationship with nature. Where do we begin to be humans? Where do we end being humans? Well, I come back to the questions, right? I'm going to be sharing the first one with you. It's about family. What do you think the place of the family should be in concerning reproduction? And there are many different definitions of family. What do you think about this topic, about this concept of family? Any of you, go ahead. Well, very good question, right? I think that there are many different ways of understanding the logics of families, and the family is a modern concept, in fact, and the this core family is key for modern societies and for the national state. In my book, The Heterosexual Nation, there's a chapter with a family that thinks they are heterosexual, white, that thinks they are reproductive. But then if we make this more complex, we also know that in many communities we've got what we could call extended families, where we don't have necessarily a mom, a dad, a son, a daughter, but rather families that are broad. We have a grandmother, we have a neighbor, even someone that was that broke up with a cousin or a neighbor that lives by himself. That's part of family, and this is the case in my country as well. So there are two elements I would like to highlight. A criticism carried out by feminism a long time ago was precisely that we cannot forget that these logics of the core family, thinking of a family as some beautiful thing. Well, there are some violences going on in that concept, from the dad, the uncle, the grandpa, etc. And we add to this the violence exerted by mothers concerning their children, sons and daughters. So there are tensions, contradictions in these families as well. There's violence, there's power. But I would like to highlight something here, which is that from the experience of racialized people, and I'm thinking my own family, my neighbors, when Black feminism theorized and said this is true, well, there is a great deal of violence in families, but if we look at the repression, police racism, etc., the family becomes a space for protection. And it's not by chance that in many countries, like in Spain, we find neighborhoods with Turkish people, African American people, because, and I'm going to put inverted commas here, because this is an expanded family, a common family, a community, to protect themselves versus structural racism. So everything will depend on the place. First of all, on the type of family we're talking about. And of course, undoubtedly, the logics of family is something very modern. And I'm going to include here an element that's controversial. When, for instance, you have pets, dogs, cats, etc., and we humanize them and we say, what's the limit in all this? When, for instance, lesbians get together and say, well, this is our family. Well, this is very problematic, I know, but it's also problematic because it means going into the modern humanizing logics, right? And transposing this to another type of relations between humans and non-humans, right? Because we articulate all of these as families, but I think it's problematic. It's not a nonsense, right? It's something we need to think about. That's what I would reply to your question. It is problematic. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting. I agree very much with what OCHY has just said. And I could say that, you know, I referred earlier to radical feminism. I mean, radical feminism in its early days was very anti-family. It saw the family only as a locus of oppression. And I think since then, we've learned a lot about how families have also been spaces even for poor and working class people, not just for the Victorian bourgeoisie, of attempted refuge or protection from external predatory forces, even when they were also scenes of predation internally. So it's a complicated picture. When I think about, I mean, one thought I have is about what is happening to quote unquote the family now. And when I say the family, it's not at all to dispute the idea that we still have multiple forms of kinship that that don't resemble normative families. But even the normative family is undergoing a huge change. Neoliberalization really brought to the fore, and I think certain forms of first world feminism were part of this, brought to the fore a new model of a normative family, which is called the two-earner family. That women should not be dependent on their husbands. They should also be in the paid workforce. And then, so that's the neoliberal ideal of the family, and it's the liberal feminist ideal of the family. Of course, what we know about it is that it goes with the whole idea it coincides with the remaking of labor markets, the weakening of unions, the creation of a low-wage service economy, the relocation of manufacturing to the global south or to the so-called BRICS countries in any case. And so the two-earner family is another mode of extractivism. It's about requiring many more hours per household of paid work that in order to, maintain something resembling the desired or livable standard of living. So here we see a case in, this is sort of part of what I was saying before, that the ways in which certain inadequately developed feminist impulses have coincided with or been instrumentalized by this whole set of forces that have brought us neoliberalism. So I think it's very important that we critique this whole model of the two-earner family. This is not a formula for women's liberation. It's not a formula for working class liberation. And when I think about sort of what Marxist feminists might want to say about the family today, I keep going back to, this great tradition that represented by people like Alexandra Kollontai, right? The Bolshevik Marxist feminist who was actually the minister of, I don't know what it was called, family and welfare or something, in the first Bolshevik government. So, one thing is very clear, I would say, the whole idea that socialism can mean the socialization of the ownership of the means of production, even despite what I just said about let's, nationalize all those guys, that's a totally inadequate view of socialism because it still sticks to that narrow view of what capitalism is, what the problem is. That's the economy. No, it's the relation of the economy. And so even people who I consider a great man who had some limitations, but Friedrich Engels, even Engels understood that you had to collectivize housework or something, that you couldn't leave the sphere of reproduction untouched and just change the sphere of production. I think there's so many things to think about here. And I'm not saying I have an answer, but I would like to see Marxist feminists start this thinking in a more programmatic way about what it is we really are for here. One idea is that the family, in the sense that OCHY rightly historicized for us as the sort of bourgeois project that became hegemonic, that combines all sorts of things that don't have to go together. It combines the idea of intimacy, sexual intimacy, who you're supposed to sleep with domicile, who you're supposed to share a physical living space with childbearing and child rearing, who you're supposed to have children with. And so there are all these things, who you're supposed to pool resources with. These things don't have to go together. And then you throw in the sort of welfare state model, that all of that goes with how you get your benefits, right, through your family status. These things could be completely disaggregated. They don't all have to go together. That's something about that idea of the family, that it put all that stuff together, co-residency, sexuality, sexual relations, et cetera, et cetera. So let's think about different ways of breaking that up and see what we come up with. And I would repeat Alexandra Kollontai's, just to end on a sort of provocative note, I would repeat her astounding question. The ruling class in every phase of history has its own ideal of love, right? The feudal order had courtly love. The the capitalist order had, let's say, Victorian, right, bourgeois love plus prostitution on the side, et cetera, et cetera. And she says, but no one has answered the question, what is the ideal of proletarian love? This is an amazing question. It's a great question. Maybe there shouldn't be only one idea, but let's at least pose that question and think about it. I love it.
Muchas gracias, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Nancy. We've got 5 minutes to close this session. I will very quickly ask a question, which you will have to answer very quickly, very briefly, in 2 minutes each, right? There it goes. This question is for OCHY, but of course, Nancy, you can add anything you want because it's a question that you both can answer. When the decolonial theory speaks about North and South, global North and South, is it related to the Marxist theory of dependence, or is this something that we've overcome? Are they related, these two concepts, or not? Go ahead. I think well, I think that, well, the theory of dependence for Abby Ayala in Latin America and Peru was very important because in many ways it showed the unequal view of the international commoditization and trade. Well, I mean, those who developed the theory of dependency, that is included in the Latin American Marxism, if you want, well, didn't touch other key elements of dependence. And I will mention them once again. They didn't take into account racism, heterosexism, the reproduction of labor force in terms of sex, race, or class, right? So I would say that, of course, it's been very important. In fact, a great deal of the decolonial theory is also based in analyzing things from or the international circuits and inequalities from this viewpoint. We know it now, but that helped a lot, not just the left, but it also helped us develop a critical thinking in Latin America and the Caribbean around the places occupied by the peripheries and concepts that are more problematic now versus metropole, the cities, and all the elements developed by capitalism. Right, I believe that the theory of dependence was short when it comes to tackling versus the contribution of decolonial theory. So I think that in that transnational, international relation, there were a number of different hierarchies that were articulated in the development of systems. So I think that, well, undoubtedly, we cannot leave it aside because it's important, an important element for us to think decolonial theory. Well, thank you very much, OCHY. Nancy, you've got 1 minute. Go ahead.
Well, I think I don't really need to add anything to this point. You know, dependency theory was one version of the broad family of quasi-Marxist or quasi-Marxist theories about imperialism. And to me, what's important about those theories, for leaving aside the detail of this version versus that version, what's important is the idea that it's built in to the DNA of capitalism. Back to that value problem, as I said at the outset, the impossibility of actually sustaining capital accumulation without an ongoing supply of cheap or slave labor, stolen lands and minerals and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's, I think, what all of these theories have in common. And it's true that we don't, there's a lot more to be said about how that happens, the various forms of wealth drain from south to north, and what happens also to kinship orders and to the capacity of communities to self-organize their life conditions, to protect their habitats, all of those dimensions of life that are ground up, let's say, in that maelstrom of so-called development. And dependency theory is sort of one variant in this family of theories. And I understand decolonial theory to be another. And I'm a big fan of Maria Tegui, for example, who was a great Peruvian Marxist who tried to deal with the indigenous question and land question in the context of this Marxian analysis of imperialism. So that's, for me, a good place to start.
Muchas gracias, Nancy. Bueno, hemos llegado al final.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of this wonderful plenary session. It's been a pleasure. It's been fun. We've laughed. There've been disagreements, which was actually what we wanted. Of course, we've had some contradictions there. And well, from the scientific committee of this 4th International Conference on Marxism and Feminism, we thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure. We'll keep in touch.